All right. Hi, everyone who's on. Thanks for joining. Good afternoon to the folks on the West Coast and early evening in the middle of the country and good evening on the East Coast. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started with this webinar, Imagine a Safer World, Alternatives to Policing. Next slide. So just to start off, this is what we're hoping to get through today. We'll have a welcome, a grounding exercise, tell you all a little bit more about who we are as the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom, talk a little bit about approaches to alternatives to policing, and then get to the star of the show, which is our panel discussion. Well, you have the opportunity to hear from some folks who are doing really good and deep work in our communities, building alternatives to policing. And then at the very end, you'll get a little more information about how to get involved in the People's Coalition. So just to begin and get ourselves grounded in the work for the evening, we want to talk about what is your wildest dream of a safe world. If you feel so inclined, you can grab a pen or paper to help capture your thoughts. You can close your eyes, envision, daydream, whatever is going to work best for you. We just want you to really abandon what you may have been told is realistic or politically feasible about what a safe world looks like, about a world without prisons, without police. What are people doing in this world that's safe? How do you feel? We're going to take a minute for you to kind of sit with that thought. Feel free to share some responses in the chat if you're so inclined. And while you're doing that, I'll share a vision, which is that in a world without police, without prisons, that is still safe, where we are all caring for each other. Macias, Bryant's little sister, maybe would have had several adults in her community that she could call on who were trained in de-escalation, who knew how to intervene without creating further harm. And maybe she and all of the other people like her that we know would still be alive today if we as communities had the alternatives that we need to keep us truly safe. Next slide. So a little bit of background about the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom. We're also known as the People's Coalition, or PCSF as an acronym. We're a coalition of base building and member-led grassroots organizations, mostly racial justice policy and advocacy institutions. Also majority led by Black and queer-led organizations, representing a cross-section of communities who are impacted by systems of criminalization and incarceration. We're also committed to transforming the justice system and redefining public safety. The folks on the steering committee, the organizations rather on the steering committee for the People's Coalition are seen here. This is the group of organizations that is responsible for determining the strategic direction of the campaign. So the 94 crime bill is the work that the PCSF coalition is focused on to repeal it. and replace it with something that is reimagined with a participatory democratic process for safety. And this is the background of the 94 crime bill and what was included in it, how we got where we are today. So it was passed in 1994. It implemented the 3 strikes rules and mandatory minimum sentencing, ended Pell Grants for people in prison, included the Violence Against Women Act. And importantly, the underlying logic and narrative for the crime bill was that locking people up makes communities safer, which we know, in fact, to not be true, and why there's such a need for this process of participatory democracy and getting new things in place that will keep us safe. So again, the goal of the People's Coalition is to dismantle and replace racist, harmful, and punitive policies that have fueled the crisis of criminalization and incarceration facing the United States, with policies and budgets that invest in communities and decarcerate our country. And to really sort of ground us in this work and this conversation is a quote from Mariam Kaba. As a society, we have been so indoctrinated with the idea that we solve problems by policing and caging people that many cannot imagine anything other than prisons and the police as solutions to violence and harm. People like me who want to abolish prisons and police, however, have a vision of a different society built on cooperation instead of individualism, on mutual aid instead of self-preservation. What would the country look like if it had billions of extra dollars to spend on housing, food, and education for all? And here we have an opportunity to see a little bit of what it might look like, right? Currently, police are mostly responding to quality of life concerns, the criminalization of poverty and addiction, and not interpersonal harm. And so alternatives must allow people the dignity of survival. And we know that, alternatives to policing really must include problem-solving response teams and more resources that allow people this dignity of survival. So public toilets, public washrooms, safe places to congregate, right? These are the reasons that people are often policed. It's not one size fits all. It's going to take some creativity, trial and error, commitment to a vision of safety that does not reproduce harm, addressing root causes of violence. It'll be experimentation, right? We will need to make the road by walking it. There'll be community options for accountability and interpersonal harm. And there will be an opportunity as we go forward in the panel, of course, for you to hear about the work that those folks are doing in this area. All right, for the next moment to learn a little bit more about some alternatives to policing that are already out there, that folks are doing great work on building up, I want to invite everybody to go and visit the website millionexperiments.com. And this slide will remain up so you can go back and forth and check out these questions that we'd love to see some responses in the chat as you're going through the website. And just note what catches your eye. What examples of alternatives to policing would you like to see tried in your own community? What's some ongoing work in your community that mirrors some of the examples on this website? And perhaps what is a lingering question you still have about alternatives to policing? Jen, if you can go back one slide and just leave that one up for a moment, thank you. A reminder, if you have something that you'd like to share that catches your eye from the website, go ahead and drop it in the chat. And thanks. I'm seeing something from Mariana, who says that they'd love to hear more about narrative strategies for alternatives to policing. All right. I'm going to go ahead and move on. If you do still have any more questions or ideas or responses to Million Experiments, you can continue dropping in the chat, and folks may have the opportunity to address it during the panel. Speaking of the panel, I am so thrilled to introduce you all to these folks who are out there doing this important work for our people. Really doing that job of answering that question, who do we call and how do we keep us safe? So we are going to have Asantewaaa from Mental Health First Teams in Oakland and Sacramento, Moki Macias from Atlanta Policing Alternatives and Diversion Initiative, Aislinn Pulley from Chicago Torture Justice, and the panel will be moderated by Deidre from BYP 100. Thank you so much, and I leave it to you.
Thank you, Aja, for taking us through some of the, really setting us up for this conversation that we're going to be having tonight. I want to welcome again everyone to the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom teach-in series. And so this teach-in is part of a series that we do to help get the political education that we need out there about the 1994 crime bill and all of the ways that it is affected and impacted our community, but also how we are trying to repeal it, how we're trying to replace it, and build power across this country to really address the issues of anti-Blackness and criminalization in our communities. Tonight we have closed caption available. If folks look at the bottom of their screens along the options, you should be able to see the option to have the closed captions available. And I want to bump up or help promote our coalition, encourage folks to check out our YouTube, our website, safetyandfreedom.org, and also follow us on Twitter to get updates on what we're doing as a campaign. And there's many organizations that are at the table of directly impacted people and grassroots organizers, and we are the ones that really need to determine what the replacement for safety and for real safety and wellness looks like for our communities. So this is the time of the night where we actually get to hear directly from folks that are doing this work on the ground in our communities, folks that I would trust to be doing this work in our communities. And I have the enviable task of moderating a conversation between them. So just want to encourage folks to utilize the chat if you have questions, or utilize the Q&A function for questions, and we'll try to really have a juicy conversation around some alternatives alternatives to policing that are real and tangible. So and I want to allow you all to introduce yourselves. And again, my name is Deidre, or Didi. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the National Director of BYP 100, and BYP 100 is a steering committee member of the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom. So I want to turn it over to the panelists to introduce yourselves. Just tell our audience who you are, where you're from, the work that you do, and how did you get into alternatives to policing work. And so I want to start first with Aislinn. If you want to go first to introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Aislinn, and born and raised Chicagoan. And I am one of the co-executive directors of the Chicago Torture Justice Center, or CTJC for short. We were founded out of the 2015 reparations ordinance for survivors of police torture. And specifically this ordinance, which is the first and currently only of its kind in the country, we hope that changes, was a result of decades of fights by survivors, by their family members, by attorneys, and by organizers who fought to reveal what was called a torture ring, which now we know has many, many, many components to it, which began by a former police commander named John Burge, who was in the Vietnam War and the Korean War and engaged in what they called advanced interrogation techniques, which is torture, and used those torture techniques on the Black community, primarily in Chicago, between the years of 1972 to 1991, when he was finally fired. It took that long to get him fired. So that's 3 decades of him leading many, many torture rings, working with many, many, many detectives. The fight to get the stories of torture out into the open took 20 years, which led to his firing. It then took another decade in order to begin to see people being freed en masse from the tortured confessions that he forced on people. And eventually that culminated in the abolition of the death penalty in Illinois, which happened in around 2006, I think. And then he was finally brought up on charges after the statute of limitations had expired on torture, and was found guilty of obstruction of justice and served 3.5 years. That then prompted the community and survivors to then come together in answering the question, what actually is justice? What could reparations look like outside of the carceral system? And so out of that art project, it was an exhibition, came the reparations ordinance. And we fought for 3 years, got it passed, and then became the first city in the country to do it, which then birthed the creation of the Chicago Torture Justice Center, which currently is the only center in the country dedicated to survivors of domestic torture. And that's by design, because they're federally regulated to only deal, the other centers, which there are about 14, are federally limited to deal with international torture. So that's who I am, that's the organization I'm representing, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Asantewaaa, do you want to go next?
Yes, my pleasure. My name is Asantewaaa. I'm one of the co-founders of the Anti-Police Terror Project, and also one of the co-creators of Mental Health First, which is a non-police mental health crisis response team. I also am a mother and a grandmother, and a poet, and I'm also a registered nurse in the emergency room here in Sacramento. What brought me to this work? I think I was just saying this the other day. I come from a long line of folks who gave care, either by consent or unconsensually, as work, right? So I have great examples of what it looks like to not only take care of individuals, but also like communities. My mother was for lack of better terms, like Big Mama, you know? So when we see that there's like this problem in our community, right? Police, murder, assassination, whatever term we're using today, something had to be done about it, right? And then there's also just some formative experiences I had in my youth of seeing folks in my community harmed, killed, that as I got older and kind of put my energy into activism, who both my mother and grandmother did, who were great examples. It was obvious that this was something that impacted our community and something needed to be done about it. So the form of APTP was some years after the assassination of Oscar Grant, and we began to ask ourselves, what are we actually doing about it outside of the reactionary framework? Though valuable, right? Past the showing up in the streets, what are we doing after that? So we developed APTP, which is a multi-generational, multi-ethnic organization that consists of not only individuals, but also organizations. And we started to think about how we wanted to impact this thing. And one of the first things that we did was create independent investigations, right? A lot of the feedback that we heard from families after a while was justice perhaps didn't look like someone going to jail, and it looked like the general public, right, knowing that their son or that their daughter or that their child was in fact undeserving of being murdered, right? Or perhaps they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or that they in fact did not have a weapon. And as the work continued, right, just because of the kind of folks that we found that folks were calling us in these instances, right, where there was a mental health crisis or someone had a health issue happening. So then we began to ask ourselves, how can we make this available to the larger community? And mental health first was the answer to that question, especially since 1 in 4 folks who are murdered by the police are in the midst of a mental health crisis. So that is our, as we continue to ask the question, how are we going to impact this? It's identifying trends and then creating solutions, right, to meet those trends.
Thank you. And Moki, you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. Good evening. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I appreciate going after you, Asantewaaa, because APTP is I just really appreciate and respect the work that y'all do. I'm like totally fangirling out. And also just happy to be here with everybody to learn and to share. Moki Macias, I am the Executive Director for the Policing Alternatives and Diversion Initiative in Atlanta. We came out of a grassroots campaign led by the Solutions Not Punishment Coalition in 2013, which was really focused on reducing police interactions, targeting and arrests using low-level city ordinance violations of Black trans women in several of the neighborhoods of Atlanta. And the real vision was, started out as providing an immediate alternative to arrest, so that as community members putting pressure on our local police department, to not address survival activities through arrest, that there was some other place to connect people. And so that's how the work started out. Over the last several years, we've sort of been shifting. We continue to offer that, but now starting January of this year, actually, we're offering a way for people to call for our teams, our harm reduction teams, without police involvement. So folks use the 311 line, which is our city non-emergency services line, and can actually reach out saying, there's a disturbance happening, or somebody seems to be really disoriented and in need of help, or various things that may otherwise result in a 911 call are now coming to our teams. So I have the pleasure of getting to represent our work tonight, but our organization is now a 26-member team, and consists of folks that have been doing work in the behavioral health field and just doing outreach work for a long time. And I think really have bring that sort of spirit to bear to say, this doesn't have to be, we can sort of demystify what the police do, right? We can demystify the idea of like, there is something, you know, unique about responding to somebody you don't know who may be in need of support, right? So I think that's kind of the lens that we bring into this. For myself personally, I'm from New Mexico originally. I'm a mama to 2 kids. I've lived in Atlanta since 2006. And as a queer femme in the South, I feel like it has been, I really, hope to represent my adopted home well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation. And we actually have a video that that goes along with this conversation. And so what we'll do is we'll play the video, and then afterwards we will get into the conversation.
I've seen how it can go in the community, how things can take a wrong turn. Something has to be done.
So we have this video of this dude. He's a white guy in his 30s, and he's been coming up in our yards over here and just checking locks and looking for stuff to steal. At our NPU meeting this week, they mentioned this new program, so we thought we'd try to take advantage of it.
Okay, yes, sir.
I appreciate you coming out.
Okay, yeah.
And I'll show you where the guy is.
Yeah, please.
He's a white guy, dark hair. He's behind these cedar trees.
Hi, my name is Norma. I'm from PAD. You need some help? You need some help? Because we don't want the police to come along and take you away for something that's not necessary. You need some help?
What we do is provide an alternative to arrest for people who are experiencing homelessness, mental health, or substance abuse issues.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Are you looking for anywhere to stay?
We're first responders in a way.
We work with an agency called PAD. If you all ever have any needs as far as like, you know, housing, shelter, food, anything like that, you can actually call 311 and just let them know what's going on, and they'll transfer you guys to us. We're really like in place to help people. You know, sometimes police will be out here and like messing with everyone, so we're kind of an agency to step in to prevent that from happening and actually help people.
311?
311, yes, sir.
It's PAD?
Yeah, yes, sir.
I went down and lived under the freeway in the tents there down there, and got in trouble there.
The jails are full of people who have charges related to them just not being able to cope with whatever their mental health issue is or whatever their social health issue is. Instead of people being given the things that they need to resolve those challenges, they're thrown in jail. Maybe that's something that we could look into, like where we can order or ask for or do like a blanket drive so that we always have.
I would think so.
I would too.
Once we're finished getting them settled and meeting their immediate needs, they're assigned a case manager or care navigator that can provide some type of wraparound services.
This work is really a part of me because I myself have struggled with mental illness. I actually went to college on a band scholarship to play the drums and to get to band camp, and I'm not able to keep up with the demanding schedule because of where I was at mentally. That was a dream that I had to let go because I wasn't ready to handle it at the time. I feel like that gives me a certain level of empathy when I'm looking at some of these individuals and working with them, because I'm like, you know what, I really can see myself in them in a way. If you really get to talk to some of these people that are in some of these situations, you see that they have a lot more potential than the level that they're operating on.
Really, sometimes people just need to know what they have access to, and they need a helping hand to guide them to whatever that resource may be, because one little thing sometimes can make a difference in someone's life.
Yes, sir, no problem. Have a good one. All right. All right, y'all too, man. All right, take care. Exactly. Yes, sir. Okay.
Wow, that was beautiful. Shout out to the work happening in Atlanta. That was really, really inspiring to see that. And yeah, hope that we can get more into detail and that folks actually feel like some of these things that we're doing, that we're practicing, folks can actually take these things back home. I also forgot to mention I'm an active organizer with Durham Beyond Policing here in Durham, North Carolina, helped to start the campaign to also build alternatives to policing in Durham, North Carolina. So very excited about this work. So a few questions that I have just to kind of start us off and kind of ground us in where we are in this moment of movement and this moment of policing being the hot topic. And we know that organizers have been calling for divestment from the policing since they've existed. As long as the police have existed, there's been police repression, but also resistance against the police as long as they've existed. And so with this, and so last summer, what we saw was a huge uprisings, protests, and calls for a collective demand to defund the police. Want to hear from the panelists, what does defunding the police mean to you? And whoever wants to start.
So APTP Oakland some years ago began a campaign that was hyper localized because it was just in Oakland, and the call was to defund, right? But it's more than just defunding, because if the money is taken away from from police, right, we still have to have a conversation about where does that money go. So the part of the conversation that we initially engaged in was taking money away from the police and actually putting that money in a situation where it could solve some of the things that the police were engaging that they shouldn't be. Like, for instance, folks that are in the midst of mental health crisis, right? There was a span of time where some of the schools in Oakland were like systematically like closing, and of course, predominantly in Black and brown neighborhoods, right? So then we began to pose the question, so if our schools are closing and the city is getting 50% of our budget, it sounds like we don't have our priorities right together. So it's not just about like and a lot of the pushback that we've seen is like, well, you know what the people say, what if my house gets robbed, or, you know, like who's going to protect us if not the police, right? And then what creates an interesting opportunity for us is to start that political education around like, well, why is that person breaking into your home, right? Like, so we can start talking about the sources of, in quote, criminal activity, right? When I think we all know that some of those crimes are crimes of poverty, right? So how do we start to begin to lift people up so that they don't have to commit that particular brand of criminal behavior, end quote.
Yeah, I could kind of piggyback on that. You know, I think the other thing that I would say, you know, to that question is like, well, your house will probably still get broken into. It's just that then the police show up after the fact, right? So if we're trying to actually build safer communities, you know, what does that look like in terms of, you know, the way that neighbors are connected to each other, you know, the way that there's, you know, conversations happening, between folks who know each other that may actually prevent something like that occurring, right? So just to add that too, but yeah, I think, you know, the other thing I would add is just, you know, that policing has grown bigger and bigger because decision makers have created more and more reasons for police to have interactions with community members, right? So like, it's not just then divesting financially from policing, it's also divesting from policies of criminalization, right? So that, you know, when somebody in Atlanta can get arrested, spend up to 6 months in jail for public urination, right? For walking down the street, literally like walking down the controlled access highway, right? Pedestrian in the roadway, urban camping, right? Like if somebody can actually get jailed for these things, then of course we're going to have the police department, not only, proactively going out there and arresting people, but also under a lot of pressure, right? From the business community, from vocal residents, from elected officials, to sort of use the tool that they've been given and then use the laws that exist, right? So I think that those things just, and this isn't new, right? Organizers have been doing this, but I think lifting that piece up of that, like that the work of divesting from policing goes hand in hand with, like Asantewaaa said, like investing in community and also divesting from criminalization, actually removing so many of the policies that allow police to even have interactions with the community, right? Because that's how we're going to actually address police violence, right? Not by training, not by more accountability, but actually by reducing police interaction with community, period.
Yeah, I agree with both speakers, Asantewaaa and Moki's points. I think also the call for defunding also is an interruption and a disruption in the prevailing logic that has allowed mass incarceration to exist, and the enormous bloating of police budgets in this country over the past 40, 50 years, which happened at the same time as mass incarceration was developed. Also happened as part of and are connected to the larger project of neoliberalism, and specifically US neoliberalism. And so it's also a prevention, and both a practical as well as an ideological stopgap that says we reject this framing and organization of society. And in Chicago, very similar, right? Because this neoliberal logic has dominated the globe and has dominated the country. So just like Asantewaaa was talking about the closing of schools, our former mayor, Rahm Emanuel, closed over 50 public schools in 1 year in 2012. And then the next year, closed half of the city's public mental health centers. And all of that while ramping up the budget for CPD. And all of that has happened while over the last 40 years, our public health system and infrastructure has been decimated, where we lost over 200,000 public health workers and are now reaping the consequences of that during a global pandemic. And we have no infrastructure to deal with providing the services we actually need for people as a society. So I think it's all of those things. And it's also a movement that has the potential to, and this might be a little hyperbolic, but I do think the potential is real, to end neoliberalism and force through movement, through mass movement and organizing, a new paradigm shift forward.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. And I really appreciate what all of y'all have pulled on in terms of just the different ways that we're able to articulate what we mean by saying defund the police. Like that is the tagline that people know, but there's layers underneath what we're trying to build, and the direction that we're trying to go in. And just thinking about what you said, Asantewaaa, around the things that we hear are like, well, what if this happens, and what if this happens, and what if this happens? And folks' context is really around safety, while also, but on the other side is the police, and their understanding of what is keeping people safe is also connected to profit and connected to money in a lot of ways. So just want to really thank y'all for helping me kind of draw those connections. And when we envision safer communities, when we do that visioning work together, want to hear what are some examples in history that you all pull from, that we have pulled from, or even not just in history, but things that are happening right now. What are some examples that we can pull from for envisioning safer communities? Moki, you want to go first this time?
Dang it. Yeah, sure. Yeah, you know, what has come to mind for me is like maybe a little more personal. But I think that for me, you know, I supported a friend who was experiencing a mental health emergency some years ago. And, you know, our sort of small group of people, our community, you know, were really unprepared. And I think just sort of had to muddle our way through and figure out how to really balance. There was sort of three things happening when this all happened. One was having to sort of manage the violence of the state, right? That you know, we were managing police involvement, jail. You know, we had to sort of help mitigate that to keep our friends safe. Another was to make sure that our friend and our friend's family were, you know, just physically okay. And then the third piece was to manage how to still respect our friends' autonomy and self-determination, even when they were not in a space where they were, you know, were necessarily making decisions that we felt were best. And so I think for me, like that experience was really, really impacted me and really impacted what, you know, how I show up in the work that I'm doing now, which I was doing at the time as well. But it really helped me think about that, like, you know, that safer communities, like sometimes I think we sort of promise this idea of like, well, if everybody just had what they needed, you know, then our communities would be safe. And well, that is very true, right? That like we can create so much more safety for one another if we just respected that we have these basic human needs, that we have the resources to meet, right? That every person could have safe shelter and food and privacy, right? And connection, right? But I think we oversimplify things by saying that, you know, by not also reminding ourselves that even if people have what they need, harm may happen, right? People may be in a state of emergency, and that may impact their loved ones and their extended community. And so I think it's this balancing of like, you know, people having what they need, and also recognizing that when harm happens, we are balancing those things, right? That like, we're not all going to just like end up on an island to get to recreate this, right? But I think we can build safer communities if we're sort of thinking about those elements, right? Like how we are working together and prioritizing sort of those immediate safety concerns if harm occurs, how we are having to navigate the state, and then really keeping at the center of that our loved one's self-determination, even when we may sort of at our core want to sort of like do what's best for them. I think, you know, that it's really the challenge for us in doing this work with integrity.
I can go next.
Yeah, just what are some other, thank you, Moki, for that. Just other examples that we pull from for building and envisioning safer communities.
So one thing that I really hope that we're able to do this year in Chicago is end police in schools. And I think that's a really realistic thing that we can accomplish. But part of what is at the root of just my own personal want to do this is I remember in the 90s after Rodney King and the uprisings that happened across the country, there was a push to get metal detectors and other like metal wand, the wands that they use in the schools, as along with a push for more cops in schools. And I remember the controversy. It was parents were fighting this, people were fighting this. We have never acquiesced to any of this. And so that memory is fresh, when I think about the conditions that we're existing in now, and the pushback that we get is usually some kind of narrative around, what would we do if we didn't have this? But this is a very specific example of something that is very recent. We haven't always had metal detectors and wands and, that type of militarization in our schools. We haven't always had cops in our schools. That came directly out of the Black Power movement in the 60s. That was a response by the state to mitigate Black liberation work. And so these are recent changes that we can reverse. And so we can remember back, if we are intentional about it, to what schools looked like before police were in there, before we had metal detectors. It's not that far away. Most of our history, just in the creation of this colonial settler state, existed without having police in schools, right? So we don't have to think of like a sci-fi reality in order to imagine what that would look like. So that's some of what I pull from when I think about ending policing and the way that we can limit and get rid of policing and its overreach and just reach into all aspects of life.
When I think about like some examples, something that Chairman Fred Hampton Jr. said to me, so we have to call a thing what it is, right? We can't, we can't call it police brutality when in fact it's police terrorism, right? Like we can't continue to call it, right? Anything else, like they're not prisons, they're concentration camps, right? So when we're talking about like, how are we going to in fact organize them out of our spaces, we have to call it what it is. It's extortion. If someone showed up in front of your house and was like, give me 40% of your paycheck and I'll keep you safe, and then in fact fail at keeping you safe, right? Because your house is still gonna get robbed, like the sister said earlier, right? They show up after the fact to incarcerate. Then I think we can start having a different conversation, right? If we're calling it what it is, if we're calling it extortion. So just wanted to add that piece. And then also, I mean, MH First, I think is a great example of what we can do. And also the program that we saw, like I was like choking back a little bit when we were watching the video. I was like, oh my God. And like wraparound services, like what does that look like? I can't wait till MH First like gets there, right? Because there's also like, we can crisis respond all day, but we have to acknowledge that there remains a lack of resources in the community for all the folks that need those types of services. So, and I really think like our own imaginations, right, are examples. And then just looking into our communities at those structures that are not formalized, right? Like who on the block has a bunch of kids and maybe wouldn't mind babysitting, right? That can answer some of the, right, who also may not be able to like hold down a job also at the same time, right? And we don't know why, but are like neighbor conflicts with neighbors, right? Like, why do I need to call a police officer? I need a mediator, right? If someone's having a healthcare crisis, I don't need a cop, I need a healthcare worker. So start, posing the things that make sense, right? And then also formalizing the structures that already exist in our communities, I think is a great example.
Yeah. Thank y'all for these. And I think just thinking about this question that was put in the chat around policing and crimes happening in the schools. And Aislinn, you spoke to some of this around some of the different language that they use to justify having more police in schools, but my mom doesn't remember going to school with police in them. So it wasn't that long ago. There was a way that kids went to school without having police in them. And also sometimes the police to me are used as a synonym for control as opposed to actual safety. I think sometimes we're made to kind of go into a space where safety means control, right? Controlling people, controlling Black children, how loud they are, how much fun they have, all of the things that kind of go into what it means to be a kid, and how those things are increasingly becoming criminalized, but especially when it comes to Black children. I want to hear from y'all. Like we're doing this work, we're kind of practicing what we're also preaching around. We see the world existing, we see our communities existing without police. And what are some of the biggest challenges to building and preserving the alternatives to policing that we really believe in? Just want to hear too for our audience, like what can folks anticipate as some of the challenges that we have in building and preserving alternatives to policing? And I'm sure there's many challenges, but maybe we could tackle like one or two.
Okay, I can't be the first one to start this time.
Okay, I'll referee. Aislinn, you want to go first?
Okay. So my mind immediately went to capitalism when I saw that question. Capitalism still requires
small challenge, just a small challenge.
I'm trying to get there. So, but I do think, underlying and because we have a defund CPD campaign, and so we're wrestling with like that larger question, right? Of we're demanding the defunding of the police because we're abolitionists and we want to eradicate policing and carcerality. And that necessitates the ending of capitalism because capitalism necessitates that, right? So how to then also understand that as being part of the movement that we're building and the power that we're building, the power to be able to withstand the forces of capital as they will never not need that, right? So what does that mean for us as a movement to be able to prepare? So like that larger question is just still stuck in my head and I have not resolved it. But I think aside from that, it's, the cop in the head that exists, the way that we've been indoctrinated into resolving any issue, any discomfort, any conflict with the logic of carcerality, the logic of policing, the logic of prisons as being the catch-all for everything. Instead of getting to the root, which is where survival economies come from, right? People surviving because you have to. We want to survive in this world, and capitalism organizes sectors of the population out of being able to be in the labor force, and so people will survive. And so, being able to expand to remove the cops in the head, remove the logic that has been indoctrinated, and remove the blinders so that we can see the world, see the conditions as they are.
I'll gladly go next, but I was wondering, could you repeat the question? My son had a boo-boo on his nose. He had to
Oh.
come show me. So I didn't
Of
hear the whole
course, of course. What are some of our biggest challenges to building and preserving alternatives to policing? And also, what are some of the ways we want to overcome them, or we are working towards that?
I think our greatest protection is relationship. And I think that that is something that policing has done to our communities at large, is they've been this stopgap to come in and solve issues when issues could be resolved with having relationship with the folks that are around us. And when I say relationship, I don't mean like friends, right? I mean, like, for instance, I had an issue with a neighbor, right? We resolved the issue, but the resolution looks like, how about we don't talk, like, ever, right? And we used a different neighbor to broker that, to broker that transaction. And we've both been able to live peacefully and not have any disruptions. No more police got called. I'm not screaming over the gate. I don't want to expose myself, but like, these things are things that happen in everyday life. And what fixed it was relationship, because I felt comfortable talking to someone else who also felt comfortable talking to her, right? So if we're going to sustain these alternatives, then we really have to start talking to each other, right? And build those relationships, at least based on enough trust to mitigate issues and to really keep us safe, right? Because if you don't call the police, they don't come for the most part, right? So if we stop calling and start calling our neighbors, that might be a good tagline. Call your neighbor, not the police. But yeah, it's relationship. We're gonna have to figure out a way to take care of each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would add that, I think the thing I've been thinking about a lot is just that, it's this idea that we have to have answers for the hardest thing, and I think kind of responding to one of the questions in the chat as well. But like when the shooting of happened in Atlanta at the spas targeting Asian women, and I had some conversations with folks I'm in community with here. There was this sort of like feeling of like, okay, how can we create like, alternate ways to keep ourselves safe? How can we support the Asian community, in this moment with, the idea of like, what else can we do that's not then promoting more police involvement, right? And it's like, it broke my heart in the idea of like, and what our creativity has to go towards is like having to somehow be prepared for the idea that someday on a random afternoon, somebody will walk in with a gun and shoot you, like that's not a fair premise to be able to like create and build in, right? That like, no matter what we attempt to do, there's always the question of, well, what are you going to do if, and no, I'm not criticizing the question in the chat, but I think it's there, right? That's a very present question in these conversations of like, okay, well, but what do you do if the most sort of like violent, difficult sort of rupture, occurs? And so I think, the thing for me is that like, when dealing with harm, like you can't really, healing is human scale, right? Like reparative work is human scale. It can't be mass produced, right? And so like, I think the example of DFACS, it's like, well, yes, do we all want to ensure that, each child is, well taken care of and safe? Yes. And do we know that DFACS has played a violent, terrible role in many family members' lives, particularly for Black and Brown communities, right? Because the work of keeping children safe is human scale work, right? It's not work that you can like jump into a massive institution and sort of create all the rules for and do it well, So I think that that's some of the challenge in developing solutions, is that actually, there's sort of this pressure to create like, okay, we're going to take out this massive police apparatus, and we're going to somehow figure out like this like beautiful healing centered apparatus to put in its place, when like that's not real, right? Like we have to be working on a human scale if we want our work to be really treating people like human beings. So I feel like I want our projects, our work, our visions to like have the grace to be able to develop at a human scale versus having to sort of go toe to toe with harmful institutions.
Yeah, and it brings me to something that I heard from a jurisdiction, and she's an organizer in New York and author of a book around Beyond Survival, which is around transformative justice processes. But she was saying how abolition and the idea of abolition doesn't just exist as an idea, it exists in practice. It doesn't exist in institutions, it exists in practice. And so just thinking about the some of these questions that we're constantly in around building alternatives to safety, like it has to, our answers will have to come in actually practicing the things that we believe in. So I wanna bring us to thinking about some of the something that you said, Moki, around criminalization through policy, and the ways that decision makers have created things that are considered crime and crime behavior, which means that there's particular people that are associated with that naturally, just based on the history of this country and history of policing in this country. And what our campaign and coalition, the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom, is really up to is taking a look at taking the chunk that is the 1994 crime bill that is authored by our current president, and replacing it with some of the beautiful things that folks are already doing, but at a scale that is large enough, right? At a scale that is powerful enough to really change the terrain that we're trying to build alternatives in, and make that terrain just a little bit smoother. So I would love to hear from you all. What do you feel like is our role in replacing and repealing the 1994 crime bill as it relates to the work that you all are already doing?
Is it my turn to go first again?
Yeah, there you go. You up.
Okay. I think that the solution is to continue to doing the independent work that we're doing, and to also continue to be creative. I would say if there's, and this is not just to the folks on the panel, but also like the folks who are listening, if there's an idea you have or something that you a problem that you've identified and you have a friend or two or no one, right, that share that passion about that thing, right? We're really at a place where it is our duty to start creating the world that we want to see. We're literally watching these institutions be dismantled like brick by brick, right? And the answer to that is to start creating something else, right? And if that thing is small, if that thing is large, right? But there's some of us are hammers, others of us lay bricks, right? I'm a bricklayer, right? So understand your role and then start to create whatever it is that you want to see. That's really the only way to move forward now. Those our hammers have been effective, right? And pay homage to them. But for those of us that are builders, it's time to build.
Yeah, if I could just echo that, I think that it has been really powerful for us in Atlanta to sort of be a part of a broader ecosystem. So while we, in some ways, like we can kind of represent in our work the sort of, common sense, like alternative, right? Like listen, like there's other ways, right? We can not only imagine other ways to create safer communities, but we can like do it, right? So while that has been, I think, really important, it's been a really like symbiotic thing, right? That like the organizers who are on the street and sort of pushing the demands, they can point to us, you know, and at the same time, we would not be able to do what we were doing if there wasn't that consistent, like direct pressure that the system was feeling from organizers and from folks just mobilizing, you know, around the demand. So I think that you know, I think it's exciting to think about like a very specific piece of legislation that like the timing is so right to really like to bring it back and say like, you know, there is some teeny tiny opportunity for redemption, right? Like a tiny bit of redemption if we can change this bill. But that work of being able to keep the pressure and also show the possibility, I think is just really powerful. And it's heartening to me to feel like there's been a little bit of a shift in the spaces I'm in with that recognition of people being like, seeing the strategic roles of our various organizations, right? That not everybody has to be an organizer and not everybody has to be, the bricklayer, like you said. So just to echo that.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's momentum now. We had the largest uprising in the history of this country over the summer. Over 27 million people took to the streets. Now is the time to repeal the crime bill. It continues to be extraordinarily disastrous. It created increasing levels of torturous and death-making conditions for incarcerated people throughout the country. And while we fight to end policing and prisons as a whole, we certainly can identify the specific ways in which harm is being done and demand the ending of those things. And that includes repealing the crime bill, which took away educational opportunities for people incarcerated, and created much more dire conditions for the millions of people who are being cycled throughout the system. So I think we have the movement momentum. Now is the time to really seize upon it and reverse some of the things that we can, if we're able to identify specific elements of legislation that exists that can have tremendous impact. It is incumbent upon us to take the opportunity to do that. I also think and really resonated with the idea of kind of the build, destroy kind of dichotomy. At the Chicago Torture Justice Center, some of what we have a politicized healing modality, which understands that our healing is political and our politics are healing. So our work to end torture, to end policing, to end state violence is a political organizing necessity, and it is also healing doing that work. And while we are struggling to heal and assist torture survivors in the healing, we understand that part of the healing process is to eradicate the conditions that produce that continued violence and terror. And so that means ending the systems that produce that. And so as we're doing this work, we're also learning about the true magnitude of consequences that state violence has on us as individuals, on our bodies, on our psyches, on our neural systems, as well as on our families and our communities. And so with that knowledge, we're able to also cultivate then, what is it that we need in order to be well? And so I think now is the time to really take advantage of the opportunities that the movement has provided to put those learnings into practice as we're able to destroy these systems that create harm and trauma, we're able to learn also how to be well with each other.
Thank you for this. This was a question that was earlier, that came up earlier in the teach-in, but particularly around mental or behavioral health crisis response teams, the local response teams. Just what are some of the first steps of building it, and as a way that is connecting directly to trying to shrink the interactions with the police? What are some of the first steps?
One of the first things we did was made a real critical assessment of the available resources. Just understanding what is available in your communities, and then kind of filling in the gap. I think that's where we decided on our current hours. We work over the weekend, overnight, because we identified that as when the least amount of services were available and someone was most likely to have to call the police to mitigate a mental health crisis. So first, understanding the lay of the land, right? And then the second thing that we did was start looking for programs that were already in existence in cities that look like ours. We were unsuccessful at that. We found several programs, but none that existed in a place that had similar demographics. So we looked at the different frameworks from the different cities and kind of adopted things that looked like they were working. Mommy, and did away. My other stuff for me. Nice, good job. I'll be done in a sec, okay? Train of thought gone. Yes. Other programs. So we looked at what worked and what didn't work, right? And then kind of held on to those things that worked. And then also we kind of did the same thing with trainings, figuring out what mental health first aid trainings were available, taking the things that make sense and then throwing the other things away. We also did an exercise that we call like a dreaming session, which was us just like, if resources weren't a thing, if we could have anything we want, like what would we build? And then we forced ourselves down to bring that down to like a list of 5 that started like around 60 or so different things. And what that did is it made us really invested in those 5 things, right? Because in a symbolic way, we had given up some things that we thought we could not do this without, right? So that's what we did. I hope if you do something similar, it works for you, but I would just say, understand the lay of the land before carving out anything.
Can I offer something, Dee?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, so I think one thing I wanted to just sort of put out there, and Asantewaaa, I'm really interested in what your take on this is, and I'm hoping that maybe we can have an offline conversation about this at some point. But one thing for us that we looked at when we decided that we were going to do something that would not involve the police at all is, because we had already been responding to concerns related to substance use, mental health, or extreme poverty, we knew we wanted to kind of stay in that space, but we also didn't feel like it was quite the right time for us to actually be responding to mental health crisis. And I think what I've learned over the last year or so has just been that, most times like community members don't really, there's not like a definition, right? There's not like a specific, like in the, like in word, like in text definition of like, what is a mental health crisis, right? So oftentimes community members are calling because there's something that, just doesn't seem like well or right. And so they need some support. But we kind of created this like distinction between like, oh, well, there's sort of, there's all these sort of basic needs, kind of quality of life, like kind of trying to reclaim the idea of quality of life for all, but there's all these needs. And then there's like a thin, like a bright line. And then there's the mental health crisis. And I think that that has just gotten like fuzzier and fuzzier to us, because it's just, there's just like not a clear definition of what that is. And I think that matters in that, I think when people talk about mental health crisis, there is sometimes this assumption that the response to that is treatment, right? That it's sort of like there's a medical thing, medical experience happening, and therefore people need treatment, and that means hospitalization. And if they don't want to go, they need to be forced to go, right? And so when we're getting calls from community members over 311, the kind of assumption is, are you going to come like bring this person somewhere, right? And that's really, the concern is that like if you set up a mental health crisis team, right, or a team like ours, that we're going to take away the police without taking away policing, actually, right? Like that idea of removing people, right? And we're not removing them to jail, but we're removing them to treatment, So I think that there's just, I think there's some questions there to really like get clear on, maybe. And I'm not clear on it, but I think that question of like, okay, so the sort of knee jerk is like, okay, we're going to try and pull police out of responding to mental health crises, and we're going to do it. Like, what do you mean by mental health crisis, right? And what is your expectation of how people should be responded to if they are experiencing a mental health crisis or emergency, And then how will you engage community members to really get up under what their assumptions might be about what a crisis looks like and what you should do if somebody's in crisis, And I just want to say one more thing. There's a book by Liat Ben Moshe, Decarcerating Disability, that I haven't yet read, but I'm going to post it in the link to it in the chat. So I think there's just like some real wisdom that they're putting out there around this question of how we respond to mental health crisis.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for and bringing a challenge for me around this. I'm with Durham Beyond Policing, and we're in a place now where we have a community safety and wellness task force that exists at our city, county, and school level. And so just all of the things that y'all have raised today is going to stick with me as we move through this process here in Durham locally, but just also really excited about how much practice is happening, and not feeling like, we're doing this by ourselves, or we're doing something we've never, just starting from scratch. It's just the fear of it can be overwhelming, but really grateful for this time with you all. And then want to open it up to see if there's any like last requests or recommendations, answers or questions that folks have around alternatives to policing that the panelists have. Just any last thoughts?
Go build it. Go build it. Yeah, that's it. That's just whatever it is you're thinking about. Just go ahead and put that work in, man. Like if nobody else, if not you, then who?
All right. Go ahead, Aislinn.
Just gonna say, be bold and enter into experimentation. And we can think of failure as providing us more information. So I think like now is the time to really, let's try things out. Let's see what works. Let's try to figure out how to be more aligned in community and build with each other. And also one thing that Asantewaaa said a little bit earlier was, we do a lot of these things already and they're invisibilized. How can we make visible the ways that we already are in relationship with each other and take care of each other, and that has allowed us to survive. There's so many lessons just from our own lineage that we need to just raise up as evidence of this is actually how we care for each other and nurture each other.
I will just say, Dee Dee, thank you so much for your warm and awesome moderation. And yeah, it's just been an honor to be in this conversation with each of you. So thank you.
Yes.
Also,
Go
Dee Dee, I
ahead.
have to pay homage to your nails.
Oh,
They
thank you.
are fantastic.
Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Yes, they've been just giving me life this whole time. I'm like, go slower.
It's kind of my thing. It's kind of my thing. My nails, they keep me safe, you know what I mean? So thank y'all so much. This was such a juicy conversation. And you know, we don't know everything, but together we know a lot. And I'm just really excited to continue like paying attention to all of y'all's work and how we all can just grow in building something that we know needs to exist and has existed and continue to be in that lineage. So thank y'all for this. And please drop love in the chat for our wonderful panelists tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to Cameron to talk a couple last things about the campaign and the coalition.
Awesome. Thank you, Dee Dee, and thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of y'all for being here tonight with us. In the interest of time, I'm going to fly right through this. So hopefully you can see the presentation up on the screen as it's getting loaded. But basically, you know, we want to do the people's process, and we really want to democratize how legislation is written. We don't want to wait on elected officials to decide and go through the process as they normally do. We want to take it into our own hands. And so we're really working kind of with tons of orgs across the nation. So if you're already doing this work in your communities, if you want to become a part, we invite you to do so. Also, no worries if you didn't get any of the links already that are dropped in chat. We will send out an email. So if you didn't sign up before to get our emails, please, please, please drop your email in the chat and we'll add you to the list. So we'll go ahead and click through to see just a few quick points about the people's process. So basically our objectives are to catalyze national attention, like we said, to repeal and replace the '94 crime bill. And it's going to come from those proposals from the people's process. We're going to center the stories and expertise of communities and individuals who are most impacted. And we're going to support ongoing local work and building power and capacity. We're going to engage in mass political ed. So similar to this, right? To make sure everyone's on the same page and we know what we need to do and how to dream big. And we're going to co-develop the language and priority investments to actually replace this legislation. And like we've been doing all evening, right? We want to imagine alternatives to incarceration and safety to make sure we're actually staying safe. And we want to bring folks together to discuss these and really do this in a collaborative way and keep ourselves safe outside of the carceral state. So yeah, get plugged in. If you're already engaged in this work, if you're doing invest, divest work, if you're starting your own alternatives to policing in your community, whatever that work looks like, you know, we want to plug in with you. If you're not already plugged in, but you're interested, right? So you heard something tonight that piqued your interest, that made you think, I want to figure out how to do that. Check out our website, sign up with us, reach out to us, follow us on our socials, or follow our YouTube page. We want to connect with you because it's called the people's process for a reason. We really and truly can't do this without you. You can sign up at our interest form. The link is also in the chat and on the screen, bit.ly/pp_interest. And we just want to connect so we can really build this out because it's going to be a massive undertaking. This bill is decades old at this point, and it's so enshrined in so much that we've seen in our states and local policies, and we need to change it. So we really want you to be on board. Again, thank you all so much for joining us. If you have any questions, any issues, let us know. Give us an email, shout on Instagram, Twitter, all of that. And please just share this out with your family, your friends, and continue to dream and scheme and just push the boundaries of your imagination because we can have safer communities without police. It's possible. So thank you all. Stay safe and be well.